What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Mikey McNuggets coming at you on a Wednesday afternoon, and we are less than 1 week away from the NFL trade deadline, which means the Browns have some serious decisions to make on some pretty important players, and whether or not the direction this franchise decides to go in will be the route of buyers and potentially considering themselves a playoff caliber team, or they can choose to be sellers and not tank, but essentially put themselves in a position to accumulate draft capital and start preparing the roster for 2025, 2026, and beyond. So Bleacher Report asked us to come on and talk about all the potential trade scenarios for the team you cover. In this case, it's the Cleveland Browns. Will they be buyers? Will they be sellers? And I told my guys at Bleacher Report, I don't know the answer until we see Sunday's game. I have no godly idea what the Cleveland Browns want to do. Because on the one hand, Jameis is coming off an incredible performance against the Ravens, 334 yards. He threw for the 3 touchdowns, including the game winner. And you'd like to see what you have in Jameis. And if you have Jameis as your starting quarterback, based on the caliber of the rest of the roster, there's a good chance the Browns could win a decent number of games from now and the end of the season. We talked about it on the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show yesterday. When you play the schedule game, you can talk yourself into 7, 8, maybe 9 wins throughout the rest of the schedule, which probably won't happen, but you can certainly talk yourself into the possibility of the Browns finishing the season incredibly strong if you get that same level of play from Jameis Winston. It is worth mentioning, he could have thrown multiple interceptions in that game. Had Kyle Hamilton caught the most gift-wrapped interception in arguably the history of interceptions, we were having a very different conversation today. And I would say the Browns need to be sellers. And we'll talk about some of the players who would be on the trade block per se in just a second. But if you have Jameis and you have guys like Myles Garrett and Nick Chubb and Joel Bitonio and Wyatt Teller and Za'Darius Smith and Denzel Ward, guys in the primes of their career, on the back end of their primes, you kind of owe it to them to see what you have and see if you can make a playoff push. But the Browns, as we talked about on Monday, self-sabotage themselves by waiting so long to make a quarterback change. And now they're left with literally 2 games to decide whether or not the current construction of this team with Jameis at quarterback is good enough to compete for one of the final AFC playoff positions. There's a wild card team. They're 4 games out of the AFC North behind the Pittsburgh Steelers. They're probably not going to catch up to Pittsburgh or the Ravens, who are 3 games up on the Browns now. They have 1 more game against the Ravens to end the season. They still play Pittsburgh twice, so it's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely. And that's why this Chargers game Sunday is so fascinating. If they beat the Chargers and improve to 3-6, they'd be potentially 1 game out of the final wild card spot. And a majority of their losses this season have come against NFC opponents. They're actually not doing too bad against the AFC, and that's what the primary tiebreaker is if the Browns were to put themselves in a position for the 7th or 6th seed in the playoff chase. So what do? Well, I don't have a great answer until we see what happens Sunday. But because this is Wednesday, and Bleacher Report asked me to tell you what I do, here's the answer. As much as I think Jameis has the potential to lead the Browns on a Joe Flacco-esque run over the final 2 months of the season, I also think it's pretty unlikely the Browns, even with Jameis playing at the level he did last week, win 7 or 8 of their remaining 9 games, which is what is going to be at minimum the requirement to reach the AFC playoffs. I think it's going to take 10 wins to get in there, and the Browns are currently 2-6. They have to go 8-1 to get to that double-digit win plateau. And I just, as much as I like Jameis and as awesome as he was, like I said a second ago, we are a dropped interception that was gift-wrapped from above from an all-pro safety from the Browns being 1-7 and us having a totally different conversation. So because I think Jameis can lead the Browns to 5, 6 wins over the next 2 months, which would be awesome, and had Jameis been the starter all season, I think the Browns are 5-3 right now, not 2-6. And then we'd be having a totally different conversation if that was the case. Then I would say you'd be buyers at the deadline. You try to solidify another receiving option, maybe some secondary help because Denzel Ward is now dealing with his 6th concussion and is unlikely to play against the Chargers. Or maybe you look at some linebacker help because both Jordan Hicks and JOK are dealing with their own injuries. JOK not expected to play this weekend. Jordan Hicks is closer to being a game-time decision. So maybe you fortify that. If you don't fully trust Nick Chubb to be 100% healthy, which he looked much better in his second game than he did in his first, maybe you look for some backfield help. But because you waited so long to make the quarterback change, and although I reserve the right to change my opinion after this Chargers game on Sunday, I really do think the Browns' best course of action, not necessarily for this season, but for the overall trajectory of the franchise as a whole, is to be mini sellers at the deadline. You have guys like Zadarius Smith, who's having a much better 2024 than he did a 2023. But he's not getting any younger. He's essentially on a one-year deal. And there are some NFC and AFC contenders that can use a veteran pass rusher of the caliber of Zadarius Smith. A fifth and a sixth round pick for Zadarius to help rebuild your draft capital for the upcoming rebuild or mini rebuild that's inevitably ahead of the Browns. Hopefully you get more, but you'd have to consider it. Maybe a fourth rounder from the Lions, for example, who lost Aiden Hutchinson to a pretty devastating lower leg fracture. I think it was 3 weeks ago. He's a guy that I think is expendable and on the trade block if Andrew Berry decides to become a seller. You also have guys behind Zadarius like Isaiah McGuire. Alex Wright would have been there had he not gotten hurt. Like Isaiah Thomas, who have proven in their very, very limited snaps, they're worthy of getting at least a little bit of a bigger opportunity to prove whether or not they're a piece of this long-term franchise outlook. Whether or not Isaiah McGuire, who had the fumble that led to the Rodney McLeod touchdown against the Raiders a few weeks ago, that was their lone offense or lone touchdown after the very first drive of the game. He's had a couple really nice reps in his limited play action and his limited action on the field over the last couple of weeks. It would be nice to see if maybe he's your long-term answer opposite of Myles Garrett. Same with a guy like Isaiah Thomas or the other number of defensive ends on the Cleveland Browns roster. Dalvin Tomlinson's another guy who I think would be in relatively high demand if the Browns decided to make him available in trade talks over the next few days. He's a veteran defensive tackle, really good against the run. He's okay against the pass when it comes to getting after the quarterback, but look at the lack of line depth on some of the premier teams across football. Dalvin Tomlinson, who can be cut after this season for a minimal loss, so it's more of a rental than a long-term investment for any team looking to trade for him. If you get rid of Dalvin for a day 3 pick, that opens the door for more opportunities for guys like Mike Hall Jr. to step into the rotation and play some meaningful snaps. And if you go back and you watch the tape against the Ravens, we did a whole discussion on Mike Hall today on the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show. I thought he played really, really, really well. His stats in the box score, 1 tackle, 1 quarterback hit, nothing to brag home about with that, but he was chasing down Lamar Jackson. So to think he was going to make tackles or even really get hits on Lamar with his speed is kind of far-fetched, but he was generating pressures left and right, and that was really exciting to see from the Browns' top draft pick in this most recent draft class, who missed the first 5 games of the season while dealing with some off-the-field issues. So Zadarius Smith's an option. Dalvin Tomlinson's an option. Juan Thornhill's another guy who has come to the Browns as a free agent. Was it last season? Yeah, last season was his first year here in Cleveland. He signed a 3-year deal. The first 2 were guaranteed. The third one is up at the team's discretion. They can get out of it. The guaranteed money will be out of the way. He's a veteran safety with championship experience. That's a plus for a team who, let's say, like the Houston Texans, who have their own secondary concerns, that might be able to get a player, and I apologize for my phone buzzing, that's supposed to be on vibrate, might be able to use that veteran leadership and experience and turn it into a guy who can contribute in the playoffs. Another late day 2, early day 3, and more likely mid to late day 3 pick for a guy like Juan Thornhill, just to help you build up the draft assets. So if the Browns like a guy in the 4th round, they may be able to package together 2 or 3 later picks to move up and target a guy. On the offensive side of the ball, I don't think they'd trade Joel Bitonio, but for the right offer, I think you'd have to consider it. He's old. He's not getting younger. He looks a step slow this season. When you add all that together, we've seen a bit of a decline in the all-pro left guard's play, and you just drafted his replacement in Zach Zinter, So despite the fact Zinter didn't look terrific in his first couple of games filling in for Wyatt Teller at right guard, maybe look a little better at left guard, which is what he played predominantly at Michigan. For a third-round pick, would you part ways with Bitonio? It's at least worth having that conversation. The most interesting two conversations the Browns are going to have internally over the next few weeks, next few days. The trade deadline is next Tuesday on Election Day. The two most interesting conversations are surrounding the quarterback and the running back. What do you do with Jameis Winston, and what do you do with Nick Chubb? If Nick Chubb plays a snap for another team that's not the Cleveland Browns, there will be people in the city of Cleveland, which is right outside the window right there, that will revolt, that will riot. Maybe not riot, that's probably a little extreme, but will revolt against the Haslams, against Andrew Berry, against the team. Nick Chubb deserves the opportunity to finish his career in Cleveland if he wants. And that's a big if. If Nick doesn't want to go through another rebuild and the Browns tell him, Nick, we don't think this is a playoff team. We don't think we're going to win many games. We're going to look to make a quarterback change next season. Could be another 2-3 years before we think we're truly competitive again. And he says, I don't want to do that. What do? You have to explore the option. If you do your due diligence, I would not trade Nick Chubb. But if he says he doesn't want to go through a rebuild, and that's the decision as a franchise you're deciding to make, you don't really have a ton of options. You kind of have to consider it and at least give him the option to ask for a trade if he wants. The same thing with Myles Garrett. Now, Myles would fetch the biggest return of any of these players. He's earned the right to decide whether or not he wants to finish his Hall of Fame career with the same team it started with. But Myles, who has yet to win anything in his career, he's won one playoff game since being drafted in 2017. If he says, I don't want to go through a rebuild, what do you do? What do you do? Now, you can't hold these guys hostage. You can make them honor their contract. They can finagle their way out of it. We've seen it happen before. But if you have a chance to get 2 first-round picks for Myles Garrett and you're going through a rebuild, you have to seriously consider it. For those two players in particular, Nick Chubb and Myles Garrett, I would take calls because that's what you have to do as a general manager. And before I said yes or no to any answer or to any offer, I have a conversation with them and say, guys, we want you to finish your career in Cleveland. We can't fathom, we can't imagine, we can't stomach the fact of seeing you in another jersey. So we are going to decline any offer regardless of what the compensation is. It could be 5 first-round picks. We're going to say no unless you tell us specifically you do not want to go through a rebuild. And as long as you're on board, you ain't getting moved. But if you don't want to go through that process with us, then we're going to have to find a way to maximize the return on our investment in you as the player. That's the only way Nick Chubb and Myles Garrett are getting dealt. Everyone else we've mentioned so far, they stick around or not, they don't have the cachet with the organization or the fan base to call their own shots. The Browns have to do what's best for them, for those players, and they have to do what's best for Nick Chubb and Myles Garrett in those instances. Now, here's the fun one. What do you do with Jameis Winston? Because if you are a buyer at the deadline, you go in with the idea that Jameis Winston isn't just the quarterback for this Cleveland Browns team for the rest of the season. You go into it thinking that Jameis Winston could be the quarterback of this franchise for the next 2, 3, 4, hopefully longer. 2, 3, 4 seasons, hopefully longer. And if you decide that we like Jameis, we're not sure he's the guy long term, well, is there a team out there that'd be willing to trade legitimate draft capital in a quarterback-hungry league for a guy who's coming off a really good start against Baltimore, and there won't be a trade before the game on Sunday against the Chargers, so he'll have 2 games under his belt as a Browns starter. If he plays really well again, and a team loses his quarterback but is in playoff hunt, let's, for example, hypothetically speaking, Josh Allen were to get hurt, the Bills at 6-2 or 7-2 or 6-3, depending on the outcome of this week's game, decide we don't really like our backup, but we think Jameis can keep us afloat. We'll give you a 2nd or 3rd round pick. Well, then the Browns have another decision to make. All of these players, you're not going to give away for nothing. You have to get the proper compensation back to make the deal worthwhile. But some of these players, like, you really, really, really have to consider, is it in our long-term best interest to keep this player around? Or is the draft capital for a rebuild more important? And I think Jameis is the perfect microcosm of that decision. If he's not your long-term plan at quarterback, and you're at least thinking ahead now, 6, 7, 8 weeks down the road, that when the season comes to an end, you're going to be drafting in the top 5 or top 10 of the 2024 NFL or 2025 NFL draft, and you're going to be targeting a quarterback, then you can part ways with Jameis and not feel too bad about it. You can play DTR for the rest of the season, get an extended look at him as your potential long-term quarterback. I don't think he's durable enough to take that role by the horns, but you never know. He's earned at least the opportunity to show us a little more of what he can do. His limited starts so far have been disappointing. I'm not going to lie. I thought he played okay against the Steelers. I thought he was showing a little more promise against the Broncos before the concussion. He made some good plays. He made some bad plays against the Bengals. Last year in his first start against the Ravens, he was horrendous, but he didn't know he was starting until the day of, so it's hard to put too much of the blame on him. My point is, if you think you're drafting a quarterback in the upcoming draft in one of the first 2 rounds, then yes, Jameis is 100% expendable. The issue for the Browns is there was such high expectations coming into the season that to become a seller at the deadline just feels like a complete waste of 3.5 months. And you can argue it's already been a complete waste of 3.5 months because the Browns looked us in the eyes and told us Deshaun Watson gives us the best chance to win. And you know what? We all know that was a giant load of bullcrap. Jameis, from the get-go, gave the Browns the best chance to win, and the Browns waited until an injury to replace their quarterback. And had Deshaun not popped his Achilles against the Bengals, there's a good chance he would have started last week against the Ravens and would still be starting this week against the Chargers. The Haslems were so convinced to prove that there was something in this player that they gave the largest guaranteed contract in NFL history at the time, that they were going to play him till he couldn't play anymore. And against the Bengals, that's when the Deshaun Watson experiment came to an end, and now we enter the Jameis Winston era. Will that be a 2-week era? Will it be a 10-week era? Or will it be a 5-year era? Depends on how Jameis plays against the number 1 scoring defense in the NFL on Sunday against the Los Angeles Chargers. If he plays another good game and throws for 2 touchdowns and 250 yards, his trade value will never be higher. Never. And if you think and you believe that Jameis isn't the guy, then you have to capitalize when the oven is hot and when the iron's at its hottest. And right now, it would be the hottest for Jameis Winston. And I do think there's a team out there, and I'm not quite sure exactly what team, and it could depend on injuries and what happens this weekend in the NFL across the league, that would be willing to part ways with a 3rd-round draft pick for Jameis Winston. And I know you're going to say this. Well, what's the good of a 3rd-round pick as Andrew Berry's making the picks because his 3rd-round picks have historically not been very good, and that is 100% correct. But at some point, one of them got to hit. And you'd rather have more chances at the lottery than fewer chances, right? You'd rather have 5 lottery tickets than 1 lottery ticket. It increases your opportunity and the percentage that one of your numbers or a couple of your numbers will match up with the bingo or with the lottery balls at the end, and you could win something big. And the Browns, if they decide to go and rebuild, and that's a big if, because I do think if they win on Sunday against the Chargers, they owe it to the veterans on the team, and they owe it to the fan base, frankly, to try and be competitive and give them something to cheer about for the final 10 weeks of the season. But if they lose and or decide just to go into rebuild mode, you got to capitalize on the players who aren't part of that plan. And guys like Zadarius Smith and Dalvin Tomlinson and Juan Thornhill and potentially Jordan Hicks, heck, maybe a Myles Garrett, a Joel Bitonio, a Jameis Winston, a Nick Chubb, those guys may not be part of the long-term plan. I said it before, I want to say it again just to reemphasize it. Nick Chubb and Myles Garrett have earned the right to decide. Greg Newsome also in that boat. If Greg Newsome on the trade block and you can get some value back for him, that's a conversation you have to have as well. But I want to reemphasize this last point before we wrap up. If Nick Chubb and Myles Garrett say, I want to finish my career as Cleveland Browns, then you hang up the phone as soon as the team calls, regardless of the compensation. If anyone else we mentioned, Zadarius, Dalvin, Newsome, Thornhill, Bitonio, you know what? Bitonio's earned the right to tell the Browns, I'm finishing my career here too. Let me make that clear. Bitonio, Chubb, Garrett, you 3 have earned the right to tell the team, I'm finishing my career in Cleveland, hang up the phone. Everyone else, you're on the table. If the Browns decide to go into tank mode, then you have to do what's best for your franchise long-term. And that may be capitalizing on some fan-favorite players and turning them into assets and draft capital for the future. I'm Mikey McNuggets. You can find us on the Ultimate Cleveland Sports Show Monday through Friday. Shout out to Bleacher Report for letting us host this midweek stream. We'll find out a lot about the Browns' future plans, depending on what happens against the Chargers on Sunday. We'll see you on Sunday for the postgame show. But for now, peace.